Rich rancher pretends to sleep to test the poor widow, and freezes seeing what she does. Winter of 1887 came with a cruel bite, the kind that seeped into bones and tested a man's endurance as much as his soul. Snow draped the ranchlands in heavy silence, the winds rattling the wooden shutters of the cabin as if to remind its inhabitants of nature's unforgiving hand. Inside, a fire glowed in the stone hearth, crackling against the bitter cold, its warmth standing guard for the 3 lives bound together under that roof. Ethan Carver, the wealthy rancher known across the county for his vast land and herds, sat back in the wooden rocker by the fire. His shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, the leather vest snug against his frame, his eyes shut as if he were resting. But his mind was far from sleep. He had been testing something far more delicate than land or cattle, the truth of a woman's heart. Across the room, the poor widow Clara tended to her young boy, Samuel, brushing dust from his shoulders after he came in from chopping kindling. Life had never been gentle with Clara since her husband died in a rail accident, leaving her alone with a son and debts that threatened to swallow them whole. Yet, here she was, strong enough to keep moving, and kind enough to keep caring. Ethan had offered shelter when the storms grew fierce and their shack couldn't withstand the wind, but doubts brewed in his mind. Was Clara grateful because of him, or because of what he owned? In the still of that winter night, he chose to feign sleep, leaning back, lips parted, chest rising slow and steady, waiting to see how she would act when she thought his eyes were closed. Clara's face softened as she approached him, a cloth bundle of snow wrapped tight, pressing it gently against his side where an old injury throbbed. The rancher had taken a fall days earlier while breaking a wild stallion, and though he dismissed it with a wave of pride, Clara saw past the bravado. She leaned closer, her fingers brushing his arm with a tenderness that had nothing to do with land or money. Samuel stood beside her, his eyes wide with worry, whispering, "Mama, will Mr. Carver be all right?" Her voice, hushed and steady, answered, "He will, sweetheart. But only if we take care of him." Ethan's chest tightened, though not from pain. He had expected perhaps a glance at his pocket watch, or curiosity at the wallet tucked in his vest. Instead, all she reached for was the snow pack, pressing it against his wound, ignoring the frostbite that stung her fingers. Samuel's small hand clung to her dress, his gaze never leaving the man who had given them warmth and food in their hardest season. Ethan nearly broke the charade then, but forced himself still, letting her care unfold naturally. Hours passed, and when dawn spread its pale light across the frosted plains, Ethan stepped onto the porch with Clara at his side. The fire of the night had faded into the cool hush of morning, and their eyes met in a quiet exchange that spoke more than words. Clara's gaze carried worry, but also strength, the kind born of hardship, not of gold. Ethan studied her face, searching for any trace of calculation, but all he found was sincerity. She did not ask for riches, nor security, nor promises of inheritance. She asked nothing at all, and that silence told him everything. As days softened into weeks, Ethan's doubts unraveled thread by thread. He saw it in Samuel's drawings, the boys' laughter filling the cabin when he proudly showed Ethan a picture of the two of them, hand in hand, the sun shining over their shoulders. It wasn't cattle or wealth the boy captured on paper, it was family, the warmth of belonging. Ethan's heart stirred with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. One evening, after supper, Samuel brought his drawing to the table, holding it high. "Look, Mr. Carver, that's you and me." Ethan smiled, the image nearly breaking him. The boy's eyes glittered with pride, and Clara's smile was soft but guarded, as though she dared not hope for more than what life had already stolen from her. Ethan placed a calloused hand on the boy's head, then looked at Clara. She met his gaze across the lantern's glow, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. And in that silence, Ethan realized the truth he had long searched for. She had cared for him when she thought he wasn't watching, not for his land or cattle, but because she saw him as a man. And Samuel saw him as something he had longed for, someone to call father. The winter of 1887 had begun with suspicion and loneliness, but as the fire roared in the hearth and laughter returned to the walls of the cabin, Ethan understood something far greater than the weight of his fortune. He had pretended to sleep, but in truth, Clara had awakened him, showing him what it meant to be truly seen and truly loved. Ethan Carver could not shake the image of Samuel's small hands gripping the paper, the sun-bright smile spread across the boy's face as he spoke about fathers and family. That night, when the fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing coals, Ethan lay awake on his cot in the corner of the cabin, staring at the dark rafters above. Clara slept with Samuel tucked close to her, the faint rise and fall of their breaths the only sound besides the winter wind whistling at the shutters. He tried to convince himself that he was only offering them charity, that the presence of a widow and her son in his home was temporary. But the truth pressed heavier than the blankets. The silence felt different now. It wasn't the familiar loneliness of a rich man with land too wide and nights too long. It was filled with something warm, something dangerous, something he hadn't felt since before the war carved years away from him. By dawn, when the rooster's crow cut through the cold, he rose, pulling on his boots and coat before the others stirred. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. Frost clung to the railings, glittering faintly under the pale light. He stared out at the endless whiteness of the ranch, the smoke curling from the chimney like a promise of life against the barren land. He had everything a man could want: cattle, horses, money tucked away at the bank in town. Yet, none of it had ever filled the hollowness that grew inside him with each passing winter. And now, with Clara and Samuel under his roof, he wondered if that emptiness had been waiting for them all along. When Clara emerged, her golden hair twisted into a loose braid, cheeks flushed from sleep, she gave him a quiet nod before tending to the fire. Samuel stumbled behind her, rubbing his eyes, his small hand tugging at Ethan's sleeve. "Mr. Carver, can I go see the horses after breakfast?" the boy asked, his voice full of eagerness. Ethan chuckled, resting a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Only if you promise not to spook 'em. Horses don't take kindly to loud noises." Samuel puffed out his chest. "I'll be quiet, like a real cowboy." The boy's grin widened, and for the first time in years, Ethan laughed without feeling the weight of it. Clara turned her head at the sound, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer than before, as if that laughter revealed something she hadn't yet seen in him. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Samuel followed Ethan like a shadow, watching intently as he saddled the horses, fixed fences, or carried hay. Ethan showed the boy how to hold a rope, how to walk among cattle without startling them, and how to respect the land as much as the animals. At night, Samuel would chatter endlessly about what he learned, his excitement spilling into drawings by the fire, his crayon-stained fingers clutching paper with the wide-eyed pride only children carried. Clara, always nearby, stitched or mended clothing, her quiet presence steady and unassuming. She never asked for more than what was given. She never spoke of her struggles unless Ethan pressed. Yet, in the way she watched Samuel beam at Ethan's praise, he could see the gratitude unspoken in her gaze. One evening, after a long day of mending a broken fence in the biting wind, Ethan came inside, his hands stiff from the cold. Clara insisted he sit while she poured hot broth into a tin cup. Samuel nestled beside him, eager to show another drawing. This one had 3 figures: Ethan, Samuel, and Clara, all standing beneath a bright yellow sun, with their little cabin drawn behind them. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words would come. Clara glanced at the paper, her lips parting, then closing again as though she, too, was struck by the weight of what Samuel had drawn. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling fire. Ethan reached out, resting a hand gently on Samuel's head. "That's a fine drawing, son," he said softly. The word slipped out before he could stop it, but Samuel's eyes lit up, and Clara's breath caught. Ethan froze, realizing what he had said, but neither corrected him. Clara looked away, blinking hard, and Samuel beamed as though the word was the greatest gift he'd ever been given. Later that night, after Samuel had fallen asleep, Ethan stepped outside for air. Clara joined him, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. They stood on the porch, the cold night air stinging their cheeks, the land stretching endlessly beneath the starlit sky. "You didn't have to say that," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan turned to her, his breath clouding between them. "I didn't plan to. It just felt right." Clara's eyes glistened, though she quickly looked away. "Samuel's lost enough. I don't want him to hope for something that may not come." Ethan's chest ached at her words. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't just Samuel who hoped, that he himself felt a pull stronger than the winter winds. But he stayed silent, knowing words spoken too soon could shatter something delicate. The weeks turned to months, and winter began to soften its grip. Snow melted into muddy trails, the land breathing again under the pale sun. Ethan found himself longing for the evenings more than the days, when Clara's quiet presence filled the cabin and Samuel's laughter echoed against the wooden walls. He caught himself studying Clara's face, the curve of her smile when she thought no one was looking, the way her hair glowed like firelight when the sun dipped low. Each time, he fought against the urge to speak his heart, afraid of ruining the fragile peace they had built. One spring morning, Ethan took Samuel out to ride a gentle mare, guiding the boy's small hands on the reins. Clara stood by the fence, her hands clasped, watching with a mixture of pride and fear. Samuel laughed, the sound ringing across the pasture. "Look, Mama, I'm riding," he shouted. Clara's eyes filled with tears she quickly brushed away. Ethan glanced at her, and their eyes locked across the field. Something passed between them then, something unspoken but undeniable. When Samuel slid off the horse and ran to his mother, Ethan knew he could no longer keep silent. That evening, he found Clara sitting by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. Samuel had already drifted off to sleep in his small cot. Ethan lowered himself into the chair opposite her, the fire casting shadows across his face. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "there's something I need to say." She looked up, her blue eyes searching his. He swallowed hard, his heart pounding. "When you came here, I thought I was just helping you through a hard spell. But it's more than that now. You and Samuel, you've become more than guests under my roof. You've become family." Clara's lips parted, trembling as if she wanted to respond, but no words came. Ethan leaned forward, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't care about the whispers in town, or the past that shadows us. I care about what's here, in this cabin, in this family we've built. I care about you." Her eyes filled with tears, one slipping down her cheek. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you don't know what you're saying." He reached across the space, his hand covering hers. "I know exactly what I'm saying. I pretended to sleep that night because I wanted to know your heart. And what I saw, it changed me. You cared for me, not for what I had, but for who I am. I can't ignore that anymore." Clara's tears fell freely now, her hand trembling beneath his. "I was afraid," she admitted softly. "Afraid to hope, afraid to believe we could find happiness again. I've lived with loss, Ethan. It leaves scars." Ethan's thumb brushed against her hand gently. "So have I, but maybe scars don't have to mean the end. Maybe they just mean we've lived, and we've survived." For a long moment, silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken dreams. Then Clara leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, her tears warm against his skin. Ethan closed his eyes, wrapping his arms around her, holding her as though he had finally found what he'd been missing all his life. The fire crackled beside them, casting its glow over the cabin, and in that moment, the walls that had once echoed with loneliness now held the fragile beginning of love. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of lightness. Samuel seemed to sense it, his laughter even brighter, his joy unrestrained. Ethan worked the ranch with renewed purpose, his steps lighter as though the land itself responded to the change in him. Clara moved through the cabin with a grace that softened the air, her smile lingering longer, her laughter returning in gentle bursts that warmed Ethan's soul. They were not without struggles. The ranch still demanded endless labor, the storms still rolled across the plains, and the past still carried its shadows, but together, they faced it with a strength none of them had known alone. Spring turned to summer, and the land bloomed in wildflowers and green pastures. Samuel grew stronger, his days spent riding horses and chasing calves, his nights filled with stories by the fire. Clara's laughter filled the cabin once more, and Ethan knew that wealth, land, and cattle meant little compared to the family that had taken root in his heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Ethan stood on the porch, Clara at his side. Samuel played in the yard, his laughter ringing across the open land. Ethan turned to Clara, his heart full. He didn't need to test her anymore. He had all the proof he'd ever need, in her touch, in Samuel's smile, in the warmth of the home they had built together. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carver, the wealthy rancher, understood that true riches were not counted in cattle or coin, but in love, in trust, and in the family that had healed the loneliness of his heart. The golden hues of the sunset faded into the deep velvet of night, and the Carver ranch settled into a calm stillness. The cattle quieted in their pens, the horses in the stables shifted occasionally, their movements soft and muted beneath the chorus of crickets. Ethan stood on the porch, gazing across the vast expanse of his land. The air was cooler now, carrying the sweet scent of wild grasses and the faint smoke from the chimney. Clara leaned against the railing beside him, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders, her eyes following Samuel's laughter as the boy ran circles around a stray puppy he had taken to. Ethan watched her from the corner of his eye, struck again by how her presence seemed to soften even the sharpest edges of his world. For weeks now, life had settled into a rhythm so steady it frightened him. Ethan was not a man who trusted peace. Life had taught him it was fleeting, a gift stolen just as soon as it was given. And yet here he was, feeling the warmth of Clara's presence and the boy's joy filling spaces in his heart he never knew were empty. Clara tilted her head, her golden hair catching the moonlight. "You're quiet," she said softly, her voice carrying just above the hum of the night. Ethan smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as though she were afraid of the answer. Ethan's gaze lingered on Samuel for a moment before he spoke. "About how quickly things change. A few months ago, this house was just wood and stone, cold as the winters that bit through it. Now," he trailed off, swallowing back the words that crowded his chest. Clara shifted, her eyes searching his face, waiting. He met her gaze finally, the truth breaking free. "Now it feels like a home." Her lips parted, a small intake of breath catching in her throat, and in that silence their hearts spoke louder than words ever could. The next morning dawned with the smell of biscuits baking and the sound of Samuel's laughter echoing from outside. Clara moved gracefully about the kitchen, her dress brushing against the wooden floorboards as she set plates on the table. Ethan entered, wiping the sweat from his brow after tending to the animals. He paused when he saw the simple spread of food: biscuits, eggs, and a small jar of preserves Clara had made from berries Samuel had gathered. It wasn't the feast his wealth could afford, but it was more nourishing than anything he'd tasted in years, because it came from her hands. "Smells good," he said, lowering himself into the chair. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. Samuel insisted on helping. "I think half the dough ended up on the floor." Ethan chuckled, glancing at the boy who grinned proudly, flour still smudged on his cheek. "Well, that's the best part of learning," Ethan said warmly. As they ate, Samuel chattered about wanting to ride farther today, about how he wanted to draw the big red barn and the horses grazing nearby. Ethan listened with quiet amusement, answering the boy's questions. Clara watched the exchange, her eyes softening, her heart both swelling with joy and tightening with fear. She had seen what happiness looked like before, and she had seen how quickly it could be stolen. Yet, she couldn't deny that Samuel looked at Ethan as if he were a father, and Ethan looked at Samuel as though the boy were already his own flesh and blood. When breakfast was done, Ethan saddled one of the calmer horses, guiding Samuel onto its back while Clara watched nervously from the fence. "Hold the reins firm," Ethan instructed, standing close by. Samuel's small hands clutched the leather tightly, his face beaming with excitement. "I've got it," he shouted. Ethan chuckled. "Easy now, cowboy. Let's take it slow." Together, they walked the horse around the corral, Ethan's hand steady on the bridle, Samuel sitting tall as though he were master of the land. Clara's eyes shone with pride, but her hands gripped the fence rail as though she could steady her own racing heart through. Sheer will. When Samuel finally slid down, he ran straight into Ethan's arms, laughter spilling from him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Clara watched, her chest aching with a strange mixture of longing and fear. Days bled into weeks, and the bond between the three of them grew tighter, stitched together with shared meals, laughter, and quiet evenings by the fire. Ethan found himself drawn more and more to Clara, the lines of worry on her face softening each time he coaxed a smile from her. Sometimes, when Samuel was asleep, they would sit together in silence, the air between them heavy with things unspoken. Ethan's hand would brush hers, lingering longer each time, until she no longer pulled away. She wanted to trust this feeling, to trust him, but the scars of her past whispered reminders of how fragile happiness could be. One evening, As the fire crackled low and Samuel lay asleep in his cot, Ethan finally broke the silence that had hung too long between them. "Clara," he said, his voice steady but low, "I've been thinking about the future." She looked up from the sewing in her lap, her eyes wary but curious. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I don't want you to think you and Samuel are just guests here. You're more than that. You're a part of this place now. A part of me." Her breath caught, her fingers pausing in their work. "Ethan," she began, but he raised a hand, stopping her gently. "I know what you've been through. I know you've lost more than anyone should. And I won't pretend I can take that pain away. But I can promise you this. You won't have to face another storm alone." His eyes burned with sincerity, his words carrying the weight of a vow. Clara's hands trembled, her sewing falling to her lap. Tears welled in her eyes, but she shook her head slightly. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Afraid to believe. Afraid that if I let myself hope again, it will all be taken from me." Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was warm, firm, grounding. "Then let me carry that fear with you," he said quietly. "Don't bear it alone anymore." For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. And then, as though something inside her finally yielded, she leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. His arms wrapped around her, strong and steady, holding her as though he would never let go. The days that followed were filled with a quiet joy neither of them dared name aloud. Samuel's laughter rang brighter, his drawings now full of three figures, himself, Clara, and Ethan, always hand in hand, always smiling beneath the sun that never seemed to set. Ethan worked the ranch with renewed vigor, every task lightened by the thought of returning to Clara's smile and Samuel's eager chatter. Clara found herself humming as she worked, a melody she hadn't touched since before her husband's death, a song that seemed to belong to this new life she was building. One summer evening, the three of them sat together on the porch, watching the sky blaze with colors as the sun dipped low. Samuel leaned against Ethan's side, his eyes heavy with sleep, while Clara's hand rested quietly in Ethan's. They didn't need words, the peace between them was enough. As the stars began to appear, Ethan glanced at Clara, his heart full. He had pretended to sleep once, seeking the truth of her heart, and what he found had awakened him to a life he never thought he'd know. And as Samuel's soft breaths filled the night air, and Clara's hand squeezed his gently, Ethan knew that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. But peace on the prairie never lasted long. By late summer, rumors began to stir in town. Whispers carried on the wind about Clara, about her place in the Carver ranch, about what people thought they knew of her. Ethan heard it when he went for supplies, the sly remarks, the half-hidden smirks. "Widow found herself a fine roof to live under," one man muttered. Another laughed, "Guess the rancher didn't mind buying more than cattle." Ethan's jaw clenched, his fists tightening until his knuckles turned white, but he walked away, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a fight. Clara, too, heard the whispers when she visited the general store. Women who once offered polite smiles now looked at her with narrowed eyes, their whispers sharp as knives. She held her head high, but the weight of their judgment pressed heavy. That night, when she returned home, Ethan saw the shadow in her eyes. She tried to hide it, moving about the cabin as though nothing was wrong, but he knew. After Samuel was asleep, he stopped her, his hand gently on her arm. "Don't let their words touch you," he said firmly. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It's not me I worry for. It's Samuel. I don't want him growing up with people thinking less of him because of me." Ethan's chest burned with anger and resolve. He lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Samuel is my son in every way that matters. And no one in this town, no whisper, no rumor, can take that from him, or from us." His voice was fierce, his conviction unshakable. Clara's breath trembled, but for the first time, she believed him. The fear still lingered, but his words wrapped around her like a shield. That night, as the fire burned low, Ethan lay awake once more, staring at the ceiling. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't enough to give Clara and Samuel shelter. It wasn't enough to share meals and laughter. If he wanted to protect them, if he wanted to silence the whispers once and for all, he had to make it known to the world. He had to give them his name, his life, his everything. The following Sunday, as the town gathered for service at the small church, Ethan walked beside Clara and Samuel, his head held high. Whispers followed them as they entered, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down. But when the service ended and the congregation spilled out into the warm summer air, Ethan turned to Clara, taking her hand in his. Samuel clung to her skirt, wide-eyed, as Ethan dropped to one knee before her in front of the entire town. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Ethan's gaze never wavered from hers. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying strong and clear, "I once pretended to sleep to test your heart. And what I found woke me to a truth I can't live without. I love you, I love Samuel, and I want the world to know that you are my family. Will you marry me?" Clara's breath caught, her hand trembling in his. The crowd hushed, waiting, their whispers silenced by the weight of the moment. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes." Ethan rose, pulling her into his arms, and Samuel laughed, clapping his hands in delight. The crowd erupted, some with smiles, some with murmurs, but none could deny the strength of what they had witnessed. And as Ethan held Clara close, Samuel beaming beside them, the whispers of the town faded into nothing. For in that moment, nothing mattered but the family they had chosen, the love they had built, and the promise of the future they would face together. The churchyard buzzed with voices long after Ethan's proposal. Some whispered their approval, others raised their brows in judgment, but none could deny the power of the moment. Clara's hand was still trembling in his as they made their way back to the wagon, Samuel skipping between them, his excitement bubbling over with laughter and endless chatter. "Mama said yes, Mama said yes," he sang out, his voice carrying across the dusty street. Ethan chuckled, squeezing Clara's hand, though he felt the tension in her grip. She smiled at the boy, but Ethan saw the worry flickering in her eyes. When they returned to the ranch, Clara set to work on supper, her movements more hurried than usual. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her. Finally, when Samuel darted outside to chase the puppy, Ethan spoke. "You're quiet," he said gently. Clara didn't look up from the carrots she was slicing. "It all happened so suddenly. I wasn't expecting you to ask me like that. In front of everyone." Ethan stepped closer, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "I meant every word, and I didn't want whispers to define us anymore. I wanted them to see the truth." Clara paused, her knife hovering above the cutting board. "And if the truth makes us more of a target? If people resent you, or Samuel, or..." She broke off, her voice trembling. Ethan reached for her hand, steadying it. "Let them resent. Let them talk. What matters is here. This ranch, this family. Nothing else." His words were steady, but she could hear the steel in them, the same grit that had built the Carver name from nothing. For a moment, she searched his face, then set down the knife and let out a long breath. "I want to believe that," she whispered. Ethan brushed his thumb over her knuckles. "Then believe it, with me." The days that followed carried a new kind of energy. Word spread quickly. Ethan Carver, the reclusive rancher, was to wed Clara, the widow who had been seen as both fragile and resilient since her loss. Invitations weren't necessary. In a town as small as theirs, everyone would come, whether welcome or not. Clara busied herself with preparations, aided by a few kind-hearted women who looked past gossip and saw the warmth in her heart. Samuel was nearly bursting with pride, telling anyone who would listen that Ethan was going to be his father. Yet not everyone was pleased. One evening, Ethan rode into town to settle a debt at the mercantile and found himself facing Jonas Hale, a man known for stirring trouble when whiskey warmed his blood. Jonas leaned against a post outside the saloon, his sneer sharp as a blade. "So it's true," he drawled, spitting tobacco into the dust. The mighty Ethan Carver, marrying a woman with baggage. The men nearby chuckled low, waiting for Ethan's reaction. Ethan's jaw clenched, but his voice remained calm. "You'd best watch your tongue, Jonas." Jonas pushed off the post, swaggering closer. "I'm just saying what others are thinking. She comes to town with a child, no husband, and suddenly she's mistress of the Carver ranch. Seems convenient." Ethan's fist itched to strike, but he kept it at his side. He met Jonas's gaze, his eyes cold as flint. "One more word about Clara or Samuel, and you'll regret it." Something in his tone silenced the men who'd been eager for a fight. Jonas sneered but stepped back, muttering under his breath. Ethan turned on his heel, his anger coiled tight in his chest. He would not let venomous tongues poison what he was building. When he returned home, Clara sensed his mood instantly. She set her mending aside and studied him as he removed his hat. Someone said something, she guessed. Ethan didn't answer at first, only ran a hand through his hair, the muscle in his jaw twitching. Finally, he said, "It doesn't matter. I won't let their words reach you or Samuel." Clara rose, her eyes soft. "But they do matter, Ethan. They matter because you hear them, and they wound you even if you don't admit it." He pulled her close then, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing they say can wound me half as much as losing you would. That's the only thing that scares me." Her breath caught, her arms wrapping around him. For a long time, they stood there in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows against the walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall grass, carrying with it both promise and uncertainty. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast expanse of blue. The small church overflowed with townsfolk, their chatter filling the air. Clara wore a simple dress of ivory, altered by her own hands, and Samuel stood proudly beside her in a freshly pressed shirt Ethan had bought. Ethan himself looked every inch the rancher, broad-shouldered, steady, his suit plain but well kept. As the preacher spoke, Clara's hands trembled in Ethan's, but his grip was sure, grounding her in every vow. When the words were spoken and the rings exchanged, the congregation erupted in applause, some genuine, some forced, but all loud. That evening, the ranch came alive with celebration. Neighbors brought pies, fiddle music filled the air, and Samuel danced in circles until he collapsed in laughter. Clara's cheeks ached from smiling, her heart brimming with a joy she thought she'd never know again. Ethan stayed close, his hand finding hers often, his eyes never straying far from the two people who now defined his world. But even as they celebrated, shadows loomed. Jonas Hale and his circle lingered at the edges of the gathering, their faces dark with envy and spite. They didn't approach, but their presence was a reminder that not everyone rejoiced in Ethan and Clara's union. Ethan noticed, his gaze narrowing, but he forced himself to stay with Clara, refusing to let bitterness taint their night. Weeks turned into months, and married life settled into a rhythm. Clara ran the household with grace, Samuel thrived under Ethan's steady guidance, and the ranch prospered. Together, they faced the endless labor of the land, mending fences, herding cattle, preparing for winter. Clara often joined Ethan in the fields, her skirts tied up as she worked beside him, her laughter mingling with his. Samuel shadowed them both, eager to learn, eager to belong. One autumn morning, Ethan woke before dawn to the sound of thunder. Not from the sky, but from hooves. He threw on his boots and rushed outside to find a group of men driving cattle off his land. The moonlight revealed Jonas Hale at the lead, his face twisted in defiance. "Get back," Ethan roared, firing a shot into the air. The cattle scattered, men cursing as they tried to regain control. Jonas turned in the saddle, his sneer clear even in the dark. "This ranch should have been mine long ago, Carver. You don't deserve it, or her." With that, he spurred his horse and vanished into the night. Ethan's heart pounded as he secured the herd, fury boiling in his veins. When dawn came, he told Clara what had happened. Her face paled, fear flashing in her eyes. "He won't stop, Ethan," she whispered. "Not until he ruins everything." Ethan pulled her close, his voice hard as steel. "Then he'll have to go through me." The days that followed were tense. Ethan doubled the watch over the ranch, teaching Samuel how to stay alert, how to listen for danger. Clara tried to keep the boy's spirits high, but she felt the weight of dread pressing down with each passing day. Still, the family grew stronger, bound by love and determination. Clara often found herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking, how he worked tirelessly, how he shielded them without complaint. She loved him more fiercely with every breath, even as fear gnawed at the edges of her heart. Then came the night Jonas returned, not with cattle, but with fire. Ethan woke to the smell of smoke, the crackling sound of flames devouring the barn. He rushed outside, Clara and Samuel close behind, their faces pale in the glow of the inferno. Men rode away laughing, Jonas's voice carrying in the night, "This land will burn before it's yours." Ethan fought the flames with every ounce of strength, neighbors arriving to help, but by morning the barn was a blackened ruin. Clara held Samuel close, her tears soaking his hair. Ethan stood among the ashes, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. The loss was heavy, but not fatal. He turned to Clara, his eyes blazing with determination. "He thinks he can scare us off," Ethan said, his voice raw. "But this is our home. He'll never take it." Clara stepped forward, taking his soot-stained hand in hers. "Then we fight, together." In that moment, beneath the rising sun, their bond was tested and strengthened. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a boy bound by circumstance. They were a family forged in fire, ready to face whatever storm the world dared send their way. The barn smoldered for hours, smoke curling into the morning sky long after the flames were beaten down. The neighbors who had ridden in during the night to help now lingered, their eyes grave, their voices low as they muttered about Jonas Hale's audacity. Some offered sympathy, others warned Ethan that Hale wouldn't stop until he had destroyed more than wood and hay. Ethan listened, but his mind was already set. He thanked them for their help, his voice steady though inside his blood burned like the fire that had stolen his barn. Clara watched him from the porch, Samuel clutched tightly in her arms. The boy had cried himself nearly sick at the sight of the blaze, his drawings of horses and barns now singed ash lying in the dirt. Clara soothed him as best she could, but her own heart trembled with fear. When Ethan finally approached, streaked with soot, his shirt clinging damp with sweat, she met his eyes. "You can't let him push you into a fight," she whispered urgently. "He wants you angry. He wants you to strike so he can justify whatever comes next." Ethan cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away the soot she hadn't realized was there. "He's already justified it in his own mind," he said quietly. "This isn't about cattle or barns. It's about hate. He can't stand that we've built something he'll never have." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "And if his hate costs us everything?" Ethan leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then I'll make sure it costs him first." The following days were spent salvaging what they could from the wreckage. Friends from neighboring ranches came to lend lumber, hands, and time. Though many in town whispered, others admired Ethan's resolve, seeing the Carvers not as victims but as fighters. Samuel carried small tools and fetched water, determined to help rebuild. His little chest swelled with pride when Ethan ruffled his hair and said, "Good work, son." Clara watched those moments with a mixture of love and dread. She prayed the boy would remember the joy of building more than the fear of losing. But Jonas was not done. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ethan returned from riding the fence line to find Clara pale as snow. Samuel pressed behind her. "He came here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Jonas. He rode up bold as brass, said this land was cursed as long as we stayed on it. Said a widow didn't belong here and neither did her boy." Ethan's hands fisted at his sides. "Did he touch you?" he demanded. Clara shook her head. "No. But his words," she swallowed hard. "Ethan, he won't stop. He means to drive us out or destroy us." That night, Ethan sat at the table long after Clara and Samuel had gone to bed. The lamplight flickered over his hardened face, shadows carving deep lines into his features. He'd fought droughts, wolves, bandits, but this fight was different. It wasn't just about survival of land or cattle. It was about love. It was about protecting Clara's fragile hope and Samuel's chance at a safe childhood. And Ethan realized then that he couldn't fight Jonas alone. Not with fists, not with bullets. He needed the law, the weight of the town, and the strength of every neighbor Jonas had wronged. The next morning, he rode into town, not to the saloon or the mercantile but to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Boyd, a thick-set man with gray in his beard and a reputation for even-handedness, looked up as Ethan entered. "Carver," he said, setting aside his paperwork. "Heard about the fire. Sorry for your loss." Ethan sat down heavily in the chair opposite. "It wasn't an accident. It was Hale." Boyd sighed, leaning back. "You got proof?" Ethan's eyes blazed. "I've got his words. He taunted me in the night while the barn burned." Boyd rubbed his chin. "That ain't enough for court. But it's enough for me to keep an eye on him. Hale's been trouble for years." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "This won't stop until he's stopped. If the law won't hold him, I'll have to." Boyd met his gaze, seeing the truth in his eyes. "Don't do something you can't take back, Ethan. Let me handle it." Ethan rose, his jaw tight. Then handle it fast. Meanwhile, Clara tried to keep life as steady as possible for Samuel. She kept him busy with chores, taught him letters by firelight, and prayed silently each night when he slept. She feared the violence that hovered just beyond the horizon, feared what it might do to Ethan, feared what it might cost them all. Yet beneath her fear, a steel had begun to form. She was no longer the widow hiding from whispers. She was Clara Carver now, wife and mother, and she would not let Jonas Hale steal what they had built. The showdown came sooner than anyone expected. One crisp autumn evening, Ethan was closing the corral gate when a gunshot split the air. The bullet struck the post inches from his hand. He dropped low, drawing his revolver, scanning the ridge. Jonas Hale sat mounted, his rifle still smoking, a cruel grin on his face. "Come on, Carver," he shouted across the field. "Face me like a man." Clara rushed from the house, Samuel clinging to her skirt. "Ethan," she cried. "No." Ethan motioned her back, his heart hammering. "Get inside." Jonas rode closer, his horse kicking up dust. "You stole what's mine, Carver. The land, the respect, the woman. You think you can just walk into this town and take it all?" Ethan stood tall, revolver steady at his side. "This land was earned. Clara chose me. Samuel's my son now. You've got nothing because you built your life on hate." Jonas snarled, dismounting. He raised his rifle again, but before he could fire, the sound of hoofbeats thundered from behind. Sheriff Boyd and several townsmen rode up, rifles trained. "That's enough, Hale," Boyd barked. Jonas froze, fury twisting his features. "He's lying," he spat. "He set the fire himself to blame me." Boyd shook his head. "Save it. We've had enough of your poison. You're coming with me." Jonas's eyes darted wildly, his hatred boiling over. With a roar, he raised his rifle toward Ethan. Ethan fired first. The crack echoed across the valley, and Jonas stumbled, clutching his shoulder before collapsing in the dust. Silence followed, broken only by the sheriff's orders as his men rushed to disarm and bind Jonas. Clara stood on the porch. Samuel pressed to her, her eyes wide with both terror and relief. Boyd approached Ethan, his gaze heavy. "You had no choice," he said gruffly. Ethan nodded, his gun still warm in his hand. He looked at Clara then, at the boy who clung to her, and felt the weight of what nearly was lost. Jonas was taken away, his reign of bitterness ended. The town, once divided, now rallied around the Carvers, ashamed of their whispers and grateful for Ethan's restraint. Neighbors came again to rebuild, this time not just the barn but the trust and respect that Jonas's venom had corroded. Clara worked beside them, her laughter returning, her pride in her home clear. Samuel thrived, his drawings now filled with bright suns and strong barns, always with Ethan and Clara at the center. Winter came, and with it quiet. Snow blanketed the ranch, muffling the world in white. Inside the house, the fire burned bright, the smell of Clara's cooking filling the air. Samuel lay on the rug, sketching with charcoal, while Ethan sat in his chair, Clara curled against his side. The storm outside howled, but within their walls there was warmth, love, and peace hard-earned. Ethan looked down at Clara, her face serene in the firelight, and pressed a kiss to her hair. He thought of the journey that had brought them here, the whispers, the fire, the gunshot that could have ended everything. And he realized that the storms had only strengthened them. He once believed peace was fleeting, a gift stolen too soon. But now, with Clara's hand in his and Samuel's laughter filling the room, he knew peace was something you fought for, something you built with sweat, love, and unyielding faith. And as the wind rattled the windows and the fire crackled low, Ethan Carver knew this truth. The world could whisper, it could burn, it could rage with envy and hate, but it could never break the family forged from the ashes. Together, they had found not just survival, but belonging, not just shelter, but a home. And for the first time in his life, Ethan knew peace would last, because he would never stop fighting for it.